Peace, everybody. I already posted the piece, The Flood Myths and Etiology, and gave a general outline of the etiology that's inferred in the flood myths of Deucalion, of the Greeks, and Noah, of the Hebrews in the Bible. I want to kind of refine on a historical scale how the emergence of Indo-Europeans on the civilization stage kind of happened, and what in terms of those times we think of races and people and nations and tribes, quote unquote. A lot of these terms are thrown around historically when it comes to the Iron Age, which covers kind of the peak or the zenith of Greek and Hebrew and Roman culture. So it's actually around 1200 BC, there was this major influx into Africa, Egypt and Nile Delta, and, coastal Palestine, Anatolia, the plateau where Turkey is now. And, but there was this huge influx of barbarian tribes. So before the emergence of the official Greek and Hebrew states around the 8th century BC, Greece formally formed in 749 BC. The so-called Kingdom of Israel formed around, 900 BC. But archaeology has shown that it wasn't really as prominent as Hebrew lore makes it seem, that they even stopped calling it a kingdom per se, and they refer to it as the United Monarchy, right? But I want to step back and define what some of these tribes were, quote unquote tribes, in terms of the actual unity in the identity of Greeks and Hebrews. In ancient times, they were actually the same people. All of the different tribes that are mentioned in the Bible and mentioned in classical Greek epics were Indo-European. And by that, I mean, Europeans, white people. But in studying those ancient white cultures, the so-called classical Western cultures, I found out in the earlier stages that they're referred to as semi-savages a lot of the time, or Indo-Europeans. So I always wonder, what is an Indo-European and how is that different from a regular European? And the first definition I came across was in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the definition is a race, an ancient race of people who had no language or culture of their own, but either absorbed or overran the peoples that they came in contact with. So I'm like, okay, so this is basically pillage, plunder on a large scale. So the entire European social structure was this huge pillage and plunder complex. And if we go back, entity and, complex, whatever, because it wasn't stable, it wasn't really based anywhere. They were constantly going from place to place and first dwelling on the fringes of the already established societies, which brings to mind the fact that Egypt had a globalized economy and culture at that time. And like today, they had a brotherhood of nations. Like we have our superpowers. Egypt was the preeminent superpower, just as United States is today. So this is where the term King of Kings comes from, because the Pharaoh was the king over the other kingdoms in the inhabited world at that time, over Babylon, over Hatti, over, the Greeks in the Aegean Isles, and, over all those people. Pharaoh, was the leader of the free world. So back to the significance of these pillage, plunder countries or cultures, actually anti-cultures, becoming cultures, races, nations, etc. We can even think today how certain terms that represent negative uh, cultural implications were names given to these ancient pillage plunder enclaves. I'm going to go down the list of some that are relevant. For one, the word vandal comes from a group of roving pillage plunderers who were in, I believe, the south of Poland. And to this day, the word vandal it relays someone who destroys property. It's a term for wanton destruction. So these people were called vandals. So this is where we get the term vandalism. Another one, I forget whether they were Germanic or Brits, were the berserkers, who, was another wandering band of semi-savages who were known to travel in these huge hordes. They were thought to be under the influence or something. They were hysterical. They were often naked, just running around with spears and axes and whatnot. So berserker is where we get the word berserk. Another term was amok. They were called the amok men, is where we get the term to run amok. Okay. And coming towards the Greeks and Hebrews and biblical times, between the period of about, actually maybe you could say from 1500 BC all the way to where the Assyrians and Persians began to take over in around 800 BC to 500 BC. They had the Pillage II, right? It was where the term Philistine comes from. So Philistine wasn't a culture, it wasn't a race. It was just a general derogatory term for pillaging, plundering, invading Indo-Europeans. Pillage II was one word. Even the word Habaru meant freebooters, mercenaries, raiders, pillage, plundering, just a general term for pillage and plunder. And it's the root for the word Hebrew. So the historical Hebrews were just another pillaging, plundering band of people. And I can prove it with some historic examples and mythological comparisons. What do they call it? Comparative mythology, right? So Habaru, Pillage II, and then there was another Egyptian term. Oh, so that's also the etonym of the term Palestine. So ancient Palestine wasn't a culture. I mean, once the Pillage II, these wandering barbarians, these vagabonds, once they got a foothold in the region, then it became something that was considered, a quote unquote culture. The Philistines, the little area that they occupied in southern Canaan was called Philistia by the Romans. So Pillage II is a general barbaric term, just as Habaru and the other terms. Another term was Dinyam, which is related to not only the Hebrew tribe of Dan, but a couple of Greek enclaves in Anatolia that are related to some mythical forefathers of the Greeks. One was Danaus, the father of the Danaans, and another one was Dardanus, right? In the region near the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, there were these land bridges where the barbarians came across and entered into trade with the wealthy indigenous people at a time to where they gave their daughters into the harems of these people, and that's how they became forefathers. Also, there's an important Greek forefather named Pelops, who I will elaborate on later. This is the end of part 1. I only have 10 minutes of memory on this particular system, so we'll talk to you soon with part 2.